Let me ask you something. How much money is tied up in that tackle box of yours? Hundreds? Thousands? We all have that one special lure. Maybe it costs 20, even 30 bucks. The one with the perfect paint job and action that promises to be a game changer. Now what if I told you that expensive, perfectly engineered lure is being made completely useless by a cheap $10 spool of the wrong fishing line? Today, we're not talking about fancy lures or secret spots. We're talking about the single most neglected piece of gear that is secretly costing you fish, day in and day out. Stay tuned, because you're about to discover why you've been blaming the wrong thing all along. And let me know in the comments. Be honest, do you think more about your lure or your line before you make that first cast? For generations, the culture of fishing has been obsessed with the lure. We see a new color, a new wiggle, and we're convinced that's the ticket. Catalogs, TV shows, tackle shop walls, they're all screaming about the next hot bait. It's an easy trap to fall into. When the fish aren't biting, what's the first thing we do? We reach for a different lure. It's instinct. It's what we've always done. We rarely, if ever, stop to think about that thin strand connecting us to that lure. We spool up with whatever is on sale or whatever our grandpa used, and we never question it. This habit, this singular focus on the bait, has created a massive blind spot for millions of anglers, and it's the reason so many fishing trips end in frustration instead of success. Let's start with the most obvious, yet most ignored problem: line visibility. You can have the most realistic crawfish imitation on the planet, but if it looks like it's being dragged through the water by a rope, a wary bass or walleye isn't going to touch it. Imagine you're a big fish sitting near a rock. You see this tasty-looking meal swim by, but it has this thick, obvious line attached to its nose. It's an instant red flag. This is especially true in clear water conditions where fish have plenty of time to inspect their food. We get so caught up in lure color, but we forget that the first thing the fish might see is a highly visible line. Using heavy, opaque monofilament in gin-clear water is one of the fastest ways to guarantee you won't get a bite. It's the equivalent of a magician showing you all the wires before the trick. The illusion is shattered, and the fish just aren't buying it. We need to start thinking like the fish and realize that stealth is often our greatest weapon, and it starts with a line they can't see. Now let's talk about the action killer: line diameter. Every lure you buy was designed and tested in a lab to have a very specific action. A crankbait is meant to wiggle and dive a certain way. A jerkbait needs to slash and pause with precision. But all of that careful engineering goes right out the window if you tie it to a line that's too thick. A thicker line creates more drag in the water. Think of it like trying to run through a swimming pool versus running through the air. That extra resistance from a thick line dampens the lure's action. Your crankbait won't dive as deep, your jerkbait will feel sluggish, and your topwater plug won't walk the dog as crisply. You sit there thinking, "Man, this lure is a dud," when in reality, your line is acting like a parachute, holding it back from doing its job. Just downsizing your line by a few pound tests can completely unlock a lure's true potential and turn a dead bite into an aggressive strike. It's a small change with a massive impact. Next up is a problem you can literally see before you even cast: line memory. You know what I'm talking about. You go to cast, and the line comes off your spinning reel looking like a coiled-up slinky. This is especially bad with cheap or old monofilament. Those coils don't just magically straighten out in the water. They create slack and a disconnect between you and your lure. When you're trying to work a subtle presentation, like a drop shot or a weightless worm, those coils make it nearly impossible for the bait to look natural. Instead of a worm gently falling through the water column, it's being jerked and pulled around by a spring. This kills sensitivity too. A fish could pick up your bait and spit it out before you ever feel a thing, because the bite has to travel through all those coils just to get to your rod tip. It's like trying to feel a tap on your shoulder through a thick winter coat. If your line looks like a telephone cord, you're not fishing effectively, no matter how good your lure is. Let's dive into the great debate, stretch versus sensitivity. This is where line type really starts to matter. Traditional monofilament line has a lot of stretch, which can be a good thing sometimes. It acts as a shock absorber, which can prevent you from ripping the hooks out of a fish's mouth, especially with treble hook baits. But that same stretch is a major liability with other techniques. When you're fishing a Texas-rigged worm or a jig in deep water, you need to feel every single pebble on the bottom. With a high-stretch line, that subtle tick of a bite feels mushy and vague, if you feel it at all. This is where braided line or fluorocarbon shines. They have almost zero stretch, meaning every bit of information is transmitted directly to your hand. You feel the bite instantly, and you get a rock-solid hook set, because none of your energy is wasted stretching the line. Blaming a lure for not getting bites when you're actually just not feeling them is a classic mistake. Choosing the right line material for your technique is the difference between feeling the bite and just hoping for one. Here's a concept many anglers completely forget. Does your line sink or float? This single property can make or break your presentation. Monofilament is buoyant, meaning it tends to float or suspend in the water. This makes it a great choice for topwater lures because it helps keep your bait on the surface where it belongs. Trying to fish a popper or a walking bait with heavy fluorocarbon, which sinks, is a constant battle. The line will pull the nose of your lure down, killing its action and making it incredibly frustrating to work correctly. On the other hand, fluorocarbon is fantastic for deep-diving crankbaits, jigs, or Carolina rigs, because its density helps your bait get down to the strike zone faster and stay there. Braided line is generally neutral or very slow floating, putting it in a middle ground. Tying on a great topwater lure with the wrong line is like putting ankle weights on a sprinter. You're setting your lure up for failure from the very beginning, simply because you ignored the physics of your line. You can have the perfect line and the perfect lure, but there's one tiny point where it can all go wrong: the knot. We often learn one or two basic knots when we start fishing and never think about them again. But the wrong knot can be a massive weak point. Some knots are great for monofilament, but will slip with slick braided lines. For example, an improved clinch knot, a classic for mono, can be a recipe for disaster with braid. A Palomar knot or a uni knot is a much better choice. Furthermore, a poorly tied knot can actually hinder your lure's action. A knot cinched down tight to the eye of a crankbait or a jerkbait can restrict its movement. Using a loop knot, like a Rapala knot, can give the lure freedom to move, wiggle, and dart exactly as it was designed to. You could be losing fish to knot failure and blaming a bent hook, or getting fewer bites because of restricted action and blaming the lure's color. Your knot is the final critical link in the chain. Let's talk about getting broken off. It's one of the most heartbreaking moments in fishing. You finally get that big bite, you fight the fish, and then, ping! The line snaps. The immediate reaction for many is to blame a faulty lure, a bent hook, or just a monster fish. But more often than not, the culprit is a lack of abrasion resistance in your line. If you're fishing around rocks, wood, docks, or heavy vegetation, your line is constantly getting scraped and nicked. Monofilament has decent abrasion resistance, but fluorocarbon is generally much tougher and is a superior choice for grinding baits along rocky bottoms. Braid, while incredibly strong in a straight pull, can be surprisingly susceptible to being cut by sharp objects, like zebra mussels or a sharp rock edge. This is why a heavy fluorocarbon leader is so critical when using braid in abrasive environments. Before you blame the fish for being too strong, take a close look at the last few feet of your line. If it's frayed and chewed up, the problem isn't the lure. It's that your line wasn't tough enough for the neighborhood you were fishing in. Here's a reality check for all the braid-to-lure fans out there, especially those fishing in clear water. Many anglers love braid for its strength and sensitivity, and they'll tie it directly to their lure, believing that modern braids are thin enough to be invisible. But let's be realistic. In clear water, under a bright sun, that braided line can stand out like a sore thumb. It casts a shadow. It has an unnatural woven texture. While a fast-moving reaction bait might get bit, anything that requires a slower, more deliberate presentation is at a huge disadvantage. A fish has time to approach, inspect, and ultimately reject a bait that's tied to what looks like a piece of string. You might be getting away with it in muddy water or on aggressive fish, but in tough, clear water conditions, you are absolutely costing yourself bites. The convenience of not tying on a leader is a trade-off that often leads to blaming a perfectly good lure for a lack of success. So, what's the solution for using braid in clear water? It's simple, and it's a non-negotiable for serious anglers: the leader. Specifically a fluorocarbon leader. This gives you the best of both worlds. You get the incredible sensitivity, casting distance, and zero-stretch hook-setting power of your braided main line. Then for the last few feet, the business end of your setup, you have a section of fluorocarbon, which is nearly invisible underwater. This invisibility cloak presents your lure in the most natural way possible, without that obvious braided line spooking the fish. Connecting the two requires learning a good line-to-line knot, like an FG knot or a double uni, but the time it takes to learn is one of the best investments you can make in your fishing. The leader isn't just an accessory, it's a fundamental part of a modern fishing system that allows you to be both powerful and stealthy at the same time. A fishing setup is a system, and every part needs to work together. We often talk about balancing a rod and reel, but the line is a critical third component of that system. Spooling heavy 30-pound test line on a light-action spinning rod designed for 6-pound test is a recipe for disaster. The rod won't load properly on the cast, your casting distance will be terrible, and the line will jump off the small spool in horrible knots. Conversely, using ultra-light 6-pound line on a heavy-action flipping stick meant for 50-pound braid will get you broken off on the first hook set in heavy cover. The guides on your rod, the size of your reel spool, and the power of the rod blank are all designed to work with a specific range of line sizes. Ignoring those recommendations means you are fighting your gear on every single cast. You're not getting the performance you paid for, and your lure presentation suffers immensely because the delivery system is fundamentally broken. Let's be honest. When was the last time you changed the line on all of your reels? If you have to think about it, it's been too long. Fishing line is not immortal. It's the most disposable part of your entire setup. Monofilament and fluorocarbon are particularly susceptible to breakdown from sunlight's UV rays. That line that was rated for 12 pounds last year might only have a breaking strength of 6 or 7 pounds now. It also develops memory from sitting on the spool, becoming stiff and brittle. Braid is more durable, but it still wears out. The fibers can fray, weakening the line, and it can lose its color or coating, making it less manageable. Going out on the water with old, weakened line is asking to lose the fish of a lifetime. You wouldn't go on a road trip with bald tires, so why would you go fishing with compromised line? Respooling your reels is one of the cheapest, easiest forms of insurance you can buy to make sure your gear doesn't fail when it matters most. Does line color actually matter? The answer is a resounding yes, but it's more about you than it is about the fish. While we want an invisible presentation at the lure, using a high-visibility line, like bright yellow or neon green braid, can be a massive advantage for the angler. Why? Because it allows you to see your line and detect bites you would otherwise never feel. When you're fishing a slack-line technique, like casting a weightless Senko, you won't always feel the thump of a bite. Instead, you'll see your bright line jump, twitch, or start moving sideways. This is your signal to set the hook. This is impossible to see with clear or green line that blends in with the water. The key, of course, is to combine this high-vis main line with a long, invisible fluorocarbon leader. This way, you get the bite detection benefit of the bright line, while the fish only sees the lure and the invisible leader. It's a pro-level tactic that turns your line into a visual strike indicator. When the bite gets tough and the fish are finicky, it's time for finesse fishing. And finesse fishing is completely and utterly dependent on using light line. Trying to fish a tiny Ned rig or a delicate drop shot on 15-pound test line is completely counterproductive. First, you'll never be able to cast those lightweight baits any meaningful distance. Second, the thick line will impede the subtle, natural action that makes these techniques so effective. The bait won't fall naturally, it will pendulum back toward you because it's being dragged down by a heavy line. Third, and most importantly, pressured or neutral fish are incredibly line-shy. They will reject a presentation that looks unnatural. Downsizing to a 4, 6, or 8-pound test fluorocarbon or monofilament line is often the single most important adjustment you can make. You're blaming your lure for not getting bit, but the fish aren't even considering it because your presentation is screaming fake due to heavy, clumsy line. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum is power fishing in heavy cover. This is where you're flipping a jig into thick grass, punching through matted vegetation, or dragging a frog over lily pads. In this world, using a light line isn't just ineffective, it's irresponsible. This is the one time when stealth takes a backseat to raw power. You need a line with zero stretch and incredible strength to do two things. First, rip a big fish out of that thick cover before it can wrap you up and break you off. And second, to withstand the constant abrasion of being dragged through wood and weeds. This is the domain of heavy braid, 50, 65, or even 80-pound test. Using monofilament here is a mistake because its stretch will prevent you from getting a solid hook set and pulling the fish's head up. Using light fluorocarbon is just asking for a break-off. In this case, the line isn't just a connection, it's a winch cable. Matching the line's muscle to the environment is absolutely critical. Let's talk about the feel factor. Fishing is a sport of feel, and your line is your primary method of communication with the underwater world. It's like a telephone line that transmits information from your lure directly to your hands. A line with a lot of stretch and a thick diameter, like cheap mono, is like a bad phone connection. The signal is muffled, and you miss a lot of the detail. You might feel a big aggressive strike, but you won't feel your crankbait ticking the tops of the weeds, or your jig crawling over a piece of gravel. In contrast, a high-quality, thin-diameter braid or fluorocarbon is like a fiber optic cable. The signal is crystal clear. You can feel the texture of the bottom. You can feel the subtle change when a fish inhales your bait, and you can feel your lure's vibration. This information allows you to make better decisions and detect the most tentative of bites. If you can't feel what your lure is doing, you're essentially fishing blindfolded, and it's no wonder you think the lure isn't working. One of the most frustrating things on the water is wind. It doesn't just make casting difficult, it can completely ruin your lure's presentation, and your line is the primary victim. A strong crosswind will catch your line in the air and create a huge bow in it between your rod tip and where it enters the water. This bow creates a massive amount of slack in the system. As a result, you have almost no direct contact with your lure. You can't feel subtle bites, and when you go to set the hook, most of your power is wasted just taking the slack out of the line. Lighter, thicker, and more buoyant lines, like monofilament, are the worst offenders. They catch the wind like a sail. Thinner, denser lines like fluorocarbon or braid cut through the wind much better, minimizing that bow and keeping you in better contact. If you're constantly fighting a huge bow in your line on a windy day, your expensive lure is just sitting out there, disconnected from you, and you're missing almost every opportunity. For anyone who trolls for species like walleye, salmon, or crappie, your line diameter is not just about action, it's about depth control. This is a concept called line dive. The amount of line you let out, combined with your speed and your lure's design, determines how deep your lure will run. However, line diameter plays a huge, often underestimated role. A thicker line creates more water resistance and drag, which prevents your lure from achieving its maximum diving depth. A thinner line cuts through the water with less resistance, allowing the same lure to dive significantly deeper on the same amount of line out. If you're following a dive chart that was created using 10-pound test monofilament, but you're using 20-pound test of the same line, your lure might be running 5 or even 10 feet shallower than you think. You're blaming the lure or the color for not getting bites, when the simple truth is, your bait isn't even in the strike zone where the fish are. Finally, let's perform a simple test you can do right in your boat or on the bank. It's the lure in the water test. Pick a lure from your box, maybe one you've lost confidence in. Tie it onto your line and simply drop it in the water next to you. Don't cast it, just watch it. Does it sink naturally? If you're using a jerkbait, give the line a little twitch. Does the lure slash and dart? Or does it look like it's being held back by a stiff, coiled line? If it's a floating lure, does it sit on the surface properly, or is a heavy line trying to pull its nose under? This simple visual check can be incredibly revealing. You'll often see the negative effects of line memory or a line type that's too heavy right before your eyes. You'll see exactly what the fish sees. This little experiment can be the aha moment that proves, once and for all, that the lure isn't the problem. It's the invisible force controlling it. So, let's bring it all home. We've talked about visibility, diameter, memory, stretch, and about 10 other ways your line is actively controlling your fishing success, or lack thereof. The biggest takeaway, the real aha moment, is that your rod, reel, line, and lure are not separate items. They are one complete system, and the line is the nervous system that holds it all together. Putting the wrong line on your setup is like putting cheap bald tires on a brand new sports car. Sure, the engine is powerful, but you can't get any of that power to the road. It's the same with fishing. Your lure can't do its job if the line is holding it back, making it look fake, or hiding the bite from you. This one shift in thinking, from what lure should I use to what system should I use, will fundamentally change your approach, save you money on bad lures, and put more fish in your boat. Thank you so much for watching. If this opened your eyes, hit that like button and subscribe for more content that cuts through the noise. Now, for the comments. What's the biggest line-related mistake you've ever made that cost you a big fish? Let's all share a story and learn from each other.